My family took us on a perfect hike, but what my husband told me after the fall changed everything. And then, morning light filtered through our window blinds, catching the edge of the bed where I had already been sitting up for a few minutes, quietly tying my hair back. I'd been working as a pharmacist for over a decade, and something about the routine, prepping prescriptions, managing patients, handling the chaos with a steady face, had started to feel like a second skin. I wasn't rich or remarkable, but I felt useful. That counted for something. Downstairs, I heard the soft clink of ceramic and the scent of coffee already drifting up the stairs. Dean, my husband of 4 years, had been waking up before me just to make the coffee. He worked as a structural engineer at a local firm, practical and thoughtful in everything he did, including love. By now, our marriage had settled into something calm and reliable. Not the dizzy fireworks of our early days, but something steadier and more comforting. The kind of relationship where you don't question each other's loyalty every 5 seconds, because you've already proven it 1,000 quiet ways. Coffee's ready, gorgeous, Dean called, and I came down to the kitchen, still adjusting my collar. He handed me a warm mug and kissed my forehead like he did every weekday morning. The house was still, save for the low hum of the fridge and the distant sound of birds outside. I sipped slowly, letting the caffeine do its work. "I think Mom's going to call today," I said, watching him scoop sugar into his cup. He raised his eyebrows slightly. "You didn't see them last weekend, right?" They seemed fine the time before. My parents, Marie and Thomas, had always been the solid type. They were retired now, enjoying their slow-paced days in a modest, tidy home a few blocks from ours. Family dinners were a monthly tradition, something we had kept going without much effort. We weren't the type to cry and hug all the time, but there was warmth. My mom spent most of her free time in a neighborhood book club, and my dad had somehow become obsessed with growing tomatoes and ornamental ferns. I talked to Mom briefly, I said, brushing a crumb from the table. She said Dad's planning a greenhouse now. Dean laughed into his cup. "That man won't stop until your backyard is a jungle." I smiled, but then my thoughts drifted, as they often did, to my younger sister Ivy. "She's been spending more time with them lately," I said, trying to sound casual. Ivy had always been in between things. In between jobs, in between relationships, in between who she was and who she thought she wanted to be. She'd graduated a few years after me, but never quite landed anywhere. Now, at 30, she was back home with our parents. It wasn't a scandal or anything. Lots of people ended up back home when life went sideways. But still, something about the whole situation made me feel uneasy. Not worried exactly, just uncertain. We were close in that polite, functional way some sisters are. We texted, shared the occasional joke, remembered each other's birthdays. But there had always been a current running underneath that I couldn't name. Later that evening, after work, I found Dean in the backyard, gently turning the soil around our tulips. Spring had finally arrived in full force, and the garden we had worked on together over the past few years was starting to bloom again. Roses lined the fence, tulips along the walkway, and a few stubborn marigolds that Dean insisted on planting each year had already started to show their colors. "I was thinking," he said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans, "maybe next year we remodel the kitchen. Add an island. More counter space for your recipes." I turned the hose off and leaned against the fence post, nodding. "That'd be nice," I said, then hesitated. "And maybe by then we'll need a high chair at the table too?" Dean's eyes met mine. Not surprised, not confused, just warm. Hopeful. We hadn't made solid plans yet. It was more of a shared dream that lived in the quiet between errands and long drives. But I knew he felt the same. It was the kind of hope that didn't need to be spoken every day. That weekend, we visited my parents' house for dinner. Ivy was there, already seated at the table, sipping wine with one hand and scrolling through her phone with the other. The house smelled like baked salmon and roasted potatoes, Mom's usual weekend comfort meal. The living room looked the same as it had my whole life, right down to the crooked photo frame in the hallway. Dad talked excitedly about the pottery class he'd joined through the local community center. Mom went on about a mystery novel that had everyone in her book club divided. It was a nice night, normal, and nothing about it should have made me feel unsettled. But Ivy was quiet, barely speaking except for a few nods when spoken to. Her presence didn't feel cold, just muted, like she was watching something only she could see. After dinner, back home again, Dean and I curled up under a blanket to watch something neither of us would remember the next day. The fireplace flickered softly. We didn't say much, just sat there, quietly grateful for the normalcy of it all. It was one of those moments where I found myself thinking how lucky we were to have a home, to have each other, to not have chaos eating away at the edges of our days. And then, the next afternoon at the pharmacy, my phone rang. It was Mom. I picked it up, expecting something about her book club or a new gardening project. But her voice was unusually bright, almost rehearsed. "I have a fun idea," she said quickly. "What do you think about a family hiking trip?" I paused, confused. "Hiking? Yes. Your dad and I have been saying we need to move more." Ivy's excited, and she found a trail. She says it's beautiful. Next weekend's forecast is all clear. It felt out of character. None of us were particularly outdoorsy, but I said I'd talk to Dean and get back to her. When I brought it up that night, Dean put his paper down and smiled. "Sure," he said. "Fresh air, time with the family. Sounds good to me." Later, Ivy called me herself. Her voice had more energy than I'd heard in years. She described the trail in detail, a waterfall, an overlook, a view of the valley. "I'll bring lunch," she added quickly. "I'm making everyone's favorites." It was the kind of gesture that would have meant something if it didn't feel so practiced. Like a performance. That night, after I hung up, I stood for a while at the window, staring into the yard. The tulips were blooming. The house was still. And for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about all of this didn't add up. Saturday came faster than I expected, and by the time I stepped outside, the sky had already turned a clear, flawless blue that seemed too perfect to be real. Dean was packing a cooler into the back of the car, humming some tune I didn't recognize, and looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. I tried to mirror his energy, but something in my stomach twisted as I checked the time again. We were right on schedule. When we pulled up to my parents' house, they were already waiting at the front door in hiking gear. My mom wore a bright yellow windbreaker she'd had for years, and Dad had on a sun visor that looked like it hadn't been touched since the early 80s. They smiled, but there was something brittle about it, something overly eager, like they were trying a little too hard to act normal. I kissed Mom on the cheek and hugged Dad, noticing the slight shake in her hands and the way he avoided meeting my eyes. "Beautiful weather today," I said, trying to cut through the weirdness with a little small talk. "Perfect for a hike." "Yes, just gorgeous," Mom replied, but her voice had a tremor I couldn't ignore. It was subtle, the kind of nervousness you could miss if you weren't paying attention, but I was. I noticed everything that morning. Ivy came around the side of the house, carrying a massive backpack and holding a folded map in her hand. Her steps were brisk, determined, like she was leading a field expedition rather than a family outing. There was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not joy, not anticipation, but resolve. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Everyone ready?" she asked, her voice strangely cheerful but too crisp to feel sincere. "Today's going to be really special." We took 2 cars to Ridgewater Forest Preserve. Dean drove us ahead, and I couldn't help glancing into the rearview mirror every couple of minutes, watching my parents' car trail behind. At one point, I caught a glimpse of Ivy in the back seat, leaning forward and talking rapidly with Mom. Her gestures were tight and emphatic. It didn't look like a casual conversation. Dean tried to talk to me during the drive, something about the last movie we watched or a news article he'd read, but my mind kept drifting back to Ivy's face and that damn map. Once we arrived at the trailhead, Ivy immediately took charge. She spread the map out on the hood of their car and began pointing out the route in that same overly rehearsed tone she'd used on the phone earlier in the week. "We'll start here," she said, tracing a thin blue line through a forest path. "It's an easy walk for the first hour. Then we'll reach a waterfall, take a short break, and after that, head up the observation trail. It's a bit steeper near the top, but the view is completely worth it." Dean nodded approvingly. "Sounds good to me." I was still stuck on the phrase "a bit steeper." The last time Ivy had planned anything, it had been a birthday dinner at a restaurant she forgot to reserve. Now she was leading a wilderness trek with military precision. It didn't add up. We started walking, and for the first 30 minutes or so, the trail was actually lovely. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting moving patterns over the dirt path. Wildflowers lined the edges, and birds chirped with the kind of energy that made you feel like everything was alive in the best possible way. But even in the beauty of that moment, something felt off. My parents weren't talking, not to each other, not to us. Usually, Dad would point out every tree that looked unusual or launch into a monologue about local geology, but today, he barely said a word. Mom kept glancing around like she was waiting for something or someone. When we reached the waterfall, we sat in a circle on the rocks and unwrapped the sandwiches Ivy had packed. She'd made mine with turkey and sharp cheddar, exactly the way I liked it. Too exact. I didn't remember ever telling her that combination. Dean ate his without comment. but I noticed him giving me little side glances like he could feel the tension too. The conversation, if you could call it that, was broken and hollow. Every time I tried to steer us towards something casual, books, movies, even Ivy's job search, someone deflected or mumbled a half answer before going quiet again. It was like all of us were trapped in the same room with the volume turned down low. When we finished eating, Ivy stood up abruptly and shouldered her bag again. "Okay," she said, dusting off her hands. "Next stop, the Overlook." She sounded almost eager, like she'd been waiting for this moment since the morning began. I looked over at Mom and Dad. They didn't argue. They didn't even hesitate. They just stood up and followed her without a word. The path toward the observation deck was steep, like she said, but steeper than I expected. We started climbing, and I kept checking behind me to see how my parents were doing. Strangely, they didn't look tired. In fact, they were climbing with an ease that felt unnatural for their age, especially given how quiet and fragile they'd seemed earlier that week. "Dad," I called back, wiping sweat from my forehead. "You okay back there?" He didn't look at me when he answered. "We're fine. Almost there." It wasn't what he said, it was the way he said it. Like he was reciting a line in a script he didn't believe in anymore. By the time we reached the top, I was sweating through my shirt and my legs ached from the incline. The observation deck came into view, a wooden platform built right into the cliff face, surrounded by metal safety rails. The view was, admittedly, breathtaking. You could see the whole valley laid out beneath us like a painting, the river winding between trees and low mountains that went soft in the afternoon haze. Dean walked ahead of me and leaned on the railing, catching his breath. I followed and stood next to him, just staring into the distance, letting the wind cool my face. And then I noticed it, the quiet behind us. Too quiet. I turned. My entire family was standing about 6 feet behind us in a straight line, shoulders squared, faces expressionless. Ivy's arms were folded tightly across her chest, and her eyes were like stone. Mom looked like she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Dad just stared past me, his jaw set. "What are you all doing?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. There was a silence that lasted far too long. Then Ivy stepped forward. "Claire," she said, her voice flat and hard. "There's something I need to say." I waited, but what she said next nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. "If you weren't here, everything would finally fall into place." Time stopped. I didn't have a chance to ask what she meant, because in the next second, she lunged forward. Her hands hit my back like a freight train. I stumbled. Dean yelled my name. Then there was a blur, screaming, motion, pain. I saw Dean's arm stretch toward me just as my body tipped over the railing. In my last clear moment before everything became noise, I saw both of my parents rushing toward Dean. And then we were falling. I hit something hard before I even realized we had stopped falling. It knocked the wind from my lungs and sent a wave of pain crashing through my back and shoulder. Dean landed beside me moments later with a sickening thud, his head striking a flat rock. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. All I could feel was pain radiating from my spine and the sound of blood pounding in my ears. My head spun as I tried to process what just happened. It didn't feel real. It felt like a nightmare halfway between a dream and something too horrible to imagine. Dean groaned beside me, just barely conscious. Blood trickled down from a cut near his temple, but his eyes fluttered open. He reached for my arm, gripping it tightly, and through gritted teeth, he whispered, "Don't move. Don't breathe too loud. Just pretend we're dead." His voice was shaking, but his mind was sharp. I understood immediately. If they were still above us, if they were looking down right now, we had to appear lifeless. It was our only chance. So I stopped moving completely, even though my muscles screamed and my entire body was trembling. I could hear pebbles shifting from above, tiny sounds that felt huge in the silence. Then came voices, muffled at first, then louder as they approached the edge of the cliff. "Do you see anything?" That was Ivy. Her voice sounded calm, like she was asking for the weather report, not checking if her sister and brother-in-law had just died. "They're not moving," someone else said. I recognized the voice, Dad. His voice didn't sound relieved or horrified. It was just tired. A beat of silence followed, then Mom's voice, breaking apart. "Are you sure this was right? What if they're still alive?" Ivy snapped, her tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "We talked about this already. We've been talking about this for months. This was the only way. You wanted peace. You said you wanted a fresh start. That can't happen if she's still around." A long pause followed. I could hear someone pacing above, the crunch of boots on gravel, the occasional crack of twigs underfoot. And then, more quietly, Dad asked, "What if someone saw us?" No one saw anything, Ivy said coldly. No one ever does. The voices eventually faded. We didn't move. Not for 10 minutes. Not for 20. Not until we were sure no one was standing above us anymore. Finally, Dean exhaled slowly, wincing as he sat up. His face was pale and slick with sweat, but he was alert. "We're not safe here," he whispered. "They might come back to check. We have to get out now." I tried to sit up, but the pain was immediate and brutal. My back felt like it had been slammed with a sledgehammer. Still, I nodded. If we stayed on this ledge, we'd die here, either from exposure or by their hands. We had to move, even if it hurt, especially if it hurt. We began inching sideways along the narrow ledge, pressed so tightly against the rock wall that I could feel every bump and crevice against my ribs. The drop below us was deadly, but the thought of going back up never crossed our minds. There was no going back, only forward or down. The ledge extended farther than I expected, winding like a tightrope along the cliff's face. We followed it for what felt like hours, though it was probably just 10 or 15 minutes. Eventually, we spotted a slope, a rocky incline that looked less vertical than the rest. It wasn't safe, but it was our only option. Dean went first, finding footholds, moving slowly and carefully, and then turned to help me down. Every step burned. Every breath felt like it might be my last. But we kept going. When we finally reached flatter ground, I collapsed onto the dirt. Dean knelt beside me, checking his phone. The screen was cracked, but it lit up. "Weak signal," he muttered. "I'm going to try calling for help." He turned his back, lifting the phone above his head. I lay on my side, trying not to cry. I had no idea how long we had been climbing. I had no idea what time it was. All I knew was that my family had tried to kill me, and I was still alive. Dean returned a few minutes later, nodding. "I got through. I think they tracked the call. They said to stay put." We sat there, leaning against a fallen log, covered in dirt, blood, and fear. It was the longest half hour of my life. Eventually, we heard the sirens. Not close yet, but coming. We stood up slowly, supporting each other as we walked. Every joint ached. My feet felt like blocks of stone, but we kept moving toward the sound. When we reached the parking lot, flashing lights were everywhere. Police cars, paramedics, park rangers. And in the middle of it all, my parents and Ivy. They were standing together near their car, speaking with a pair of officers, hands gesturing like they were explaining something. "We were looking for them," Ivy was saying loudly. "They just disappeared during the hike. One minute they were there, and the next, they were gone. We searched everywhere." Then Dean and I stepped out of the trees. The entire parking lot fell silent. Ivy's face went white, then flushed red. Her eyes widened as she took a step back. She stammered. "You're alive." One of the officers turned toward us, stepping forward. "Are you the two who were missing?" Dean nodded. "We weren't missing. We were pushed." Ivy froze. My mom collapsed to her knees. Dad took a step forward and then stopped like he wasn't sure if he should run or cry. Mom sobbed. "Claire, I'm so sorry. I didn't want this." She convinced us." Dad whispered something under his breath, too low to hear. Ivy's expression hardened. "Don't say anything," she snapped. "It's not over. You don't know anything." A moment later, an officer stepped forward and began reading Ivy her rights. Her hands were cuffed behind her back as she shouted nonsense, accusations, excuses, denials that made no sense. My parents were handcuffed too, though the officers treated them less harshly, likely because they weren't resisting. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just stared at the people who had once been my family as they were led to the back of separate patrol cars. The ambulance came soon after. The EMTs checked our vitals, patched up our cuts, and helped us onto stretchers. Dean kept holding my hand. Even when they tried to separate us, he refused to let go. As we rode to the hospital, I looked at his face. He was pale, bruised, and exhausted, but he was here. Still alive. I closed my eyes and whispered, more to myself than anyone else, "We made it." Dean squeezed my hand and whispered back, "We're not done yet." But we're not done for either. And for the first time since we hit that rock, I started to believe. It took several days before I could even sit up in the hospital bed without gasping. My back was bruised from the fall, and I had a few cracked ribs that made every breath feel like I was being stabbed. Dean had a mild concussion and a long cut near his scalp, but nothing required surgery. We were lucky, and every nurse who saw us said it like they couldn't believe we were still breathing. I couldn't believe it either, to be honest. The detectives came by the second morning. They were kind, but methodical, and their questions were sharp. They asked us to go over everything. Every detail, every strange moment leading up to the hike. I told them about the weird call from Mom, about Ivy's sudden obsession with planning everything, about the quiet tension during dinner that I hadn't wanted to admit felt real. Dean added what he had overheard, the late-night phone calls in the driveway, Ivy telling Mom that if I were gone, they could finally be a family again. I watched the detective scribble notes while nodding, but his expression never changed. When the official charges were filed, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like grief. Ivy was being charged with 2 counts of attempted murder and conspiracy. My parents were both charged with aiding and abetting, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. The word conspiracy kept showing up in every headline, like this had been some elaborate plot from a crime novel, not something cooked up in a quiet living room by the people who used to cut my birthday cake. The prosecutor told us that Ivy's behavior during interrogation was erratic and manipulative. She alternated between crying, threatening legal action, and claiming that I had staged everything to make her look bad. She even accused Dean of orchestrating it to steal the family from her. It was pure madness, the kind that couldn't be reasoned with. After a psychiatric evaluation, she was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. They said her ability to feel empathy was severely impaired. According to one of the doctors, Ivy didn't fully understand the weight of what she had done, only that it hadn't worked. My parents didn't deny their involvement, not exactly. Instead, they fell into this blank haze where neither one could explain their choices. My mom cried constantly during her hearings, while my dad just stared at the floor like he was still waiting to wake up from a bad dream. They both told the judge they had been worn down, manipulated, emotionally coerced over months by Ivy's relentless presence. She had convinced them that they had to choose between daughters, that loving her meant eliminating me. When the transcripts came out, I read every word. I don't know why I did that to myself, but I needed to understand how far they had fallen. The trial began in mid-November, just as the leaves were giving up the last of their color. Dean and I sat through every day. I wanted to disappear every time Ivy turned toward me in the courtroom with that half-smile on her face, like this was all a show and she was still the star. She never apologized. She never cried. Not once. My parents sat quietly at their own table, heads bowed, barely making eye contact with anyone. I didn't recognize them. These weren't the people who used to hold my hands at school concerts or tape drawings to the fridge. These were strangers wearing the same skin. The courtroom was quiet the day the judge gave his verdict. He read the sentences slowly, without emotion. Ivy was sentenced to 16 years in prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment, and the judge said plainly that her prognosis for recovery was poor. The doctors believed she'd likely never gain a full understanding of morality or consequences. My parents each received 4 years, but half was suspended under strict conditions: community service, psychiatric counseling, and complete separation from me and Dean. They were not to contact us, not directly, not through friends, not even through letters. Afterward, as everyone stood and began to shuffle out of the courtroom, my mother approached me. Her hands were shaking, and her face was gaunt from the weight of the last several months. "Claire," she said softly, like saying my name might somehow undo everything that had come before it. "You are still my daughter. I still love you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that." I didn't say anything at first. I looked at her, really looked, and I saw a woman crushed under regret, but still too weak to stop what she'd helped put in motion. I saw someone who had let guilt grow into resentment, and resentment into silence, until silence allowed something monstrous to take shape. "I believe that you loved me once," I said, "but I don't think I can call you my mother anymore. Not after this. Maybe someday you'll find peace, but it won't be through me." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked away beside my father without another word. They looked like shadows of themselves, hollowed out and ghost-like. I didn't feel triumph watching them leave. I just felt hollow too. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild pieces of my life, though most days it felt like putting together a puzzle that had been through a fire. The physical pain faded faster than the emotional kind. Sleep came in fragments, and I'd often wake in the middle of the night, convinced I could still hear someone walking around outside the house. Dean would pull me close and whisper that it was just a tree in the wind, that we were safe, but even he couldn't always believe it. Still, something strange happened during all of this. People started to show up. Not the ones related to me by blood, but the ones who had quietly supported me all along. Our neighbors brought casseroles and offers to help with groceries. My coworker Andrea checked on me every morning before her shift started, bringing extra muffins or coffee she knew I liked. Our friends Grant and Melanie came over every Sunday just to sit on the porch with us, no questions asked. For the first time, I understood what people meant when they said that family isn't just blood. It's who stands beside you when everything else breaks. Dean and I started planting again in the backyard. We tore up the patch of ground near the shed where we used to keep old furniture and turned it into a flower bed. We picked bulbs together from the nursery, laughing quietly at names like Midnight Rose and Purple Surrender. There was something therapeutic about digging into the soil, about putting something new into the earth after so much had been taken away. One evening, while we were sitting outside watching the last of the sun dip behind the fence, Dean reached over and took my hand. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" he asked. "I don't know," I said truthfully, "but I think we'll feel new. And maybe that's better." He nodded and didn't say anything else. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid of what came next. It had been nearly 8 months since the sentencing when the first letter arrived at our mailbox, unmarked and slightly bent at the corners like it had been passed through several uncertain hands. At first, I thought it was junk mail or some distant charity request, the kind that always starts with "Dear Friend." But when I opened the envelope, there was no message, only a photograph tucked inside. It was an old snapshot from my childhood, one I hadn't seen in years, probably buried in a forgotten family album. I was maybe 8 in the photo, standing in front of a carousel, holding cotton candy with my free hand wrapped around Ivy's shoulder. She looked smaller than I remembered her ever being, her expression tight-lipped and wide-eyed, even back then. On the back of the photo, written in smudged black ink, were the words, "It should have been me." I dropped the photo and stepped away like it had burned my fingers. Dean walked in seconds later, pausing when he saw the look on my face. I couldn't speak, so I just pointed. He read the back, then picked up the envelope and turned it over twice. "No return address," he said. "No postmark either. This wasn't mailed. Someone dropped this off." We checked the doorbell camera, but it was blank from the previous night until that morning. No footage, no alerts, no movement. The camera had simply stopped recording for a window of 90 minutes, right around the time we were asleep. Dean called the security company that afternoon and ordered an entire replacement system, top to bottom. I burned the photo that night in the fireplace and watched the edges curl into black flakes as the message disappeared with the flame. We thought maybe it was just a one-time thing, a last gasp from someone still obsessed with control. But then came the second message. This time it wasn't a letter. It was a box. Small, square, left neatly on our front porch like a package from a neighbor. Inside was something worse. It was a crumpled copy of the family photo that used to hang in the hallway of my childhood home. The one taken during Thanksgiving years ago, where everyone had forced smiles and matching sweaters. Ivy had scratched her own face out with something sharp, leaving a hollow tear where her eyes used to be. Underneath the photo was a note scrawled in the same handwriting. "Family is what you choose. You chose wrong." Dean didn't say anything as he closed the box and placed it back on the table. He just stared at the floor for a long time, then walked to the closet and pulled out a duffel bag. "We're leaving," he said. "Tonight." We left the house that night with only what we needed. We didn't tell anyone, not even our closest friends. The next morning, Dean called a real estate agent to list the property, and by the end of the week, we had moved into a short-term rental in a town 50 miles away. Small, quiet, unlisted. Somewhere Ivy wouldn't think to look. The police were notified, of course, but with no fingerprints, no usable video, and no direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. Ivy had apparently escaped during a psychiatric transfer 2 weeks before that first photo arrived. She'd vanished somewhere along the state highway, leaving behind only a broken restraint strap and an open car door. They searched the woods. They issued alerts. But nothing turned up. I thought I would never sleep again. For a while, we didn't even unpack our boxes. We lived like guests in our own home, ready to disappear again at the first sign of trouble. But no signs came. The weeks passed, then months. Eventually, we began to believe that she was really gone. Not arrested, not found, just vanished, like a nightmare slipping through the cracks of daylight. Life began to resume in small ways. Dean started working again from a home office, occasionally driving into the city when necessary. I returned to a part-time job at a nearby clinic, slowly rebuilding my energy and focus. Our new neighborhood was quiet, older couples, retired teachers, the occasional teenager on a bike. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed to happen, which made it exactly what we needed. Then one afternoon, just as spring returned, we received an invitation. Our friends Grant and Melanie were getting married. The wedding would be held in early May at a local vineyard, simple and beautiful, the kind of ceremony that felt honest and earned. I cried when I opened the envelope, not out of fear this time, but because it reminded me that life didn't just stop after tragedy. It kept moving forward, stubbornly, whether you were ready or not. The ceremony was perfect, the kind of small, intimate gathering that wrapped you in laughter and soft lights. We drank champagne. We danced. We smiled without forcing it. And when we clinked glasses during the toast, Melanie leaned over and whispered, "You two look like you finally came back to life." I smiled at her, and for the first time in so long, I felt like it was true. But the feeling didn't last long. 3 weeks after the wedding, a phone call came late at night. It was the detective from our case, the one who had seen us bruised and bleeding in that hospital room almost a year ago. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of something heavy. "We found her," he said. "Or at least, what's left." I couldn't speak. Dean took the phone from me and asked the questions I couldn't. A hiker had discovered remains deep in the woods near where Ivy had vanished. It had taken time to confirm identity, but dental records and DNA were enough. Cause of death wasn't clear, possibly exposure, possibly injury, but no signs of foul play. She had wandered into the wilderness and never made it back. I didn't cry when he told me. I didn't feel anything for several hours, actually. I just sat on the couch with the window open, listening to the wind rustling the trees outside. Later that night, I took a walk alone through our new neighborhood. The houses were dark, most people already asleep. A dog barked in the distance. The world felt unusually still. There was no satisfaction in knowing Ivy was gone. No relief, no release. Just an empty space where anger used to live. She had caused so much damage, destroyed every connection we might have repaired, and in the end, her story ended where it began, in silence and isolation. A few days later, we received one final letter. It was found in a waterproof folder among her things, hidden in the hollow of a tree where she had apparently taken shelter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, and parts of it were ruined by rain, but the pieces that remained said enough. If they won't choose me, then no one will. They were never mine, but I can make them remember me forever. I didn't show it to Dean. I burned that too. 6 months later, we bought a house in a different state entirely. Somewhere far from the cliffs. Somewhere with no memories hidden in the walls. We adopted a dog from a local shelter and named her Maple because she had reddish fur and a habit of lying under trees. Life was quiet again. Not perfect, not simple, but real. Sometimes, when we sit on the porch in the evenings, Dean will look over at me and ask if I think it's over now. I usually answer with a quiet yes, but deep down, I think the truth is something different. Some endings don't come with a final door closing. Some just leave you walking further and further away from the wreckage, hoping that the pieces don't follow. But we're still walking, and that's enough.